welcome to our special coverage of Russia's commemorations marking the 78th anniversary of its victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. But this year's Victory Day comes at a time that sees Russia deeply entrenched in its invasion of Ukraine, one that's proving costly in both monetary and human terms. This year, the traditional parade of military hardware through Moscow's Red Square will be closed off to the public, although the proceedings will be given wall-to-wall coverage on state television channels. Well, let's bring in DW correspondent Emily Sherwin, who was our correspondent in Russia but had to leave the country when the Russian government shut down our offices in Moscow. Good to have you with us here, Emily. So talk to us, Emily, about the significance of Victory Day in Russia.
Victory Day is and has now been for decades an extremely significant day for Russians on a personal level, on an emotional level. After all, over 20 million Soviet citizens were killed during World War II. World War II is known as the Great Patriotic War. In Russia, almost every Russian will have some relative or distant relative who was killed during fighting against the Nazis. And people really do take time to remember that emotional side of things, and they gather to watch the parades on TV, you mentioned it. But of course, the Russian state has been kind of taking over the narrative of this emotional day, I think, more and more for the past few years. Particularly, there's a political side to this where Putin has almost created kind of a cult surrounding these celebrations of the victory against Nazi Germany as proof to almost show that Russia has this moral right, also this greatness as a military power. And now, of course, it's even harder to watch the militaristic side of this, knowing that Russia has attacked its neighbor.
Now, several regions, I understand, across Russia have canceled their parades today, and normally these celebrations are happening all over the country. Tell us more about why they're canceling them.
Well, several cities and regions have cited security concerns, and that's not just cities that are close to the Ukrainian border, as you might expect, but also, for example, the city of Tyumen, which is in Siberia, really far away from Ukraine. And some areas close to the front line were even explicit about those security concerns. For example, Belgorod, a city right near the Ukrainian border, which said that it doesn't want to provoke the enemy with, the gathering of soldiers and military equipment right in the center of the city. So it's interesting to hear that explicit reference to security concerns from regional governments. And we're also seeing, interestingly, a cancellation of the Immortal Regiment, which is people kind of gather in cities, walk through the city with pictures of their relatives who died in World War II. And it could be, of course, that the Russian government is afraid that people might also print out photos of people who died in the war in Ukraine, which they wouldn't want people to show.
So security concerns there. And this, even though the Russian government officially doesn't even allow their invasion of Ukraine to be described as a war, but simply a special military operation. We're looking at live pictures from Moscow right now. Just a moment ago, we're seeing President Putin in the crowd there. We're seeing some marchers now across the square. We are expecting President Vladimir Putin to address the crowds there, and of course, we're going to carry that live. What can we expect, Emily, from Putin's speech on this day? This is the second time that Victory Day has been celebrated in Russia since its invasion of Ukraine started.
Well, last year, Vladimir Putin took this speech not only to remember the many victims of World War II and kind of to strike this somber tone, which is what he usually does, but also to draw parallels, I think, to what's happening now in the war in Ukraine, which, of course, is known as a special operation in Russia. He kind of painted Russia as always this country that defends itself, that defends its moral right, and also also, he painted the West and NATO as being at fault for the invasion of Ukraine, for having forced Russia's hand into defending itself. So kind of drawing these historical parallels from World War II to the current time. And I would expect that we're going to hear a similar narrative. It's also important to point out that that narrative has been explicit, that those parallels from the beginning, because the Russian government said that they were going into Ukraine to, quote, denazify the country. They claim that they're fighting against Nazis in Ukraine, which, of course, is false. So those parallels have been pretty explicit, and we're expecting Putin to make those parallels again.
Do the Russian people, Emily, accept that narrative that Putin is presenting to them, trying to draw parallels to being a victim of Nazi aggression in World War II, and now what is happening with Ukraine, portraying the Ukrainians as the aggressors or NATO as the aggressors? Do the Russian people really accept that narrative?
Well, I certainly think that the narrative of this kind of besieged fortress is very strong. The idea that Russia is surrounded by enemies, that NATO has been for many years encroaching on Russia by getting too close, by trying to, even include Ukraine. That, I think, is a very strong narrative that we've been hearing for many years in Russia now, including since, the annexation of Crimea. That rhetoric has really been stepped up within Russia, and I do think that is strong. A lot of people in Russia remember the Soviet Union. They remember these two blocks, the East and the West, being pitted against each other. So I think that kind of rhetoric does work for a lot of people, and works for Putin.
You mentioned security concerns surrounding the celebrations. Again, even though Russia claims officially that it's not at war, give us some background on that. Tell us about what has happened in Russia over the past few weeks and months that would give Russians concerns about possibly being attacked on this day.
Well, the most obvious thing, and one thing that also the Kremlin itself has explicitly referred to when it comes to preparations for this parade on Red Square, is an attack by 2 drones on the Kremlin, which happened just a few days ago. So I think that's the most obvious thing that will be on people's minds. And there's been tighter security than normal surrounding the parade in Moscow, certainly. But also there have been several acts of sabotage against, an oil tanker, freight trains that have been happening within the country. And it's interesting that with the cancellation of several parades across the country, Russia's almost making these security concerns explicit now, whereas before, there was almost a sense of a parallel reality that Russia isn't really at war, that this is just, a special operation. But now we're seeing this explicit acknowledgement that, even the Kremlin has been under attack. There were claims from the Kremlin that Ukraine had attacked the Kremlin with those 2 drones, and that they actually were even trying to kill Vladimir Putin. So, this sense, again, of a besieged fortress.
And, of course, the invasion has been going on now for a long time. When it was launched in February of last year, President Putin tried to suggest that this was just going to take a few days and it would all be wrapped up. And here we are in 2023 on Victory Day, where things look a lot different. Stay with us, Emily, as we wait for President Vladimir Putin to begin his speech, which we're going to carry live. We have our correspondent in Kiev standing by for us. Nick Connolly is there. Nick, talk to us about how Victory Day is seen in Ukraine. I understand they actually moved the celebrations to a day earlier in Ukraine, and to distinguish Ukraine very much from Russia.
Well, exactly, Terry. This was all about basically coming in line with Western European commemoration of this day and kind of drawing a line in the sand between commemoration here in Kiev and what's happening in Russia. I think up to about kind of 10 years ago, the 9th of May was a fairly uncontroversial holiday here in Ukraine, and for all the problems that were there, even then, between Ukraine and Russia, it wasn't a kind of thing to distinguish Ukrainian identity from Russian about, but that certainly has changed. There's a real sense here in Ukraine that this has become basically Vladimir Putin's only kind of claim for kind of authority and legitimacy, and that basically they've privatized the memory of the deaths in the Second World War, even though most of the casualties in the Soviet Union were in Belarus and Ukraine, not in modern-day Russia, and that basically Ukrainians don't want to have anything to do with those commemorations which are kind of associated with Soviet-Russian chauvinism as it's seen here in Ukraine. And right now, obviously, in the middle of a war where you've got constant notifications, stories on your social media feed of people who are losing their lives, the memory of people who died in the 1940s is obviously slightly further away because everyone's concerned with the here and now, and the kind of real crystallization point has become the national holiday, the Independence Day in August. Last year was certainly a very kind of somber day, people kind of trying to get some first kind of conclusions and some kind of counting the losses back then. So it's a very quiet day here in Kiev.
Describe, you say it's quiet, but how are people dealing with this psychologically in Kiev? Because this is, first of all, a break from their historical tradition where they would normally be celebrating today along with Moscow. They celebrated instead yesterday, and it's a country under siege. What is the atmosphere like among the people in Kiev today?
You certainly see a lot of very tired faces, people just not able to sleep because of these constant air raid alarms, air raid warnings. That's quite a difference. Just 10 days ago or so, we had a lull of almost 2 months where it really seemed like those Western air defenses and the fact that Russia was running out of missiles had made a difference, and that now, here in Kiev at least, where you're a few hundred kilometers away from the front lines, life could get back some kind of normality. That's very definitely not the case. In terms of commemorations, you do see people. Yesterday there was some of this, and I think today also, people bringing flowers to the memorials in parks and other places, but that's on a personal level, and it's by far not as numerous in terms of the crowds as has been the case even in 2019, 2020, just before this war began. And I think there's a real sense that every day is a commemorative day here in Ukraine. You have funerals, funeral services for well-known volunteers, military people on the Maidan in the center of Kiev almost every week. So basically they're living this kind of commemorative kind of war atmosphere day in, day out. They don't really need a special day to think about the price of their independence and the price of this war with Russia.
Today is Europe Day in most of Europe. The commemoration surrounding the end of, or the victory over Nazi Germany is marked a day before, which is what, of course, Kiev did yesterday. So I'm just wondering, Nick, on Europe Day, we have there's this very special guest expected in Kiev. Tell us more about that.
Indeed, Ursula von der Leyen has arrived in Kiev, and she's expected to meet President Zelensky just in a few hours' time. I think the kind of significance of Europe Day, that is basically something that maybe people will digest once this war is over. For now, it's all pretty abstract. But there certainly are some very concrete expectations of this visit, notably military support. The EU has finally moved towards actually coordinating supplies of, especially munitions, for Ukraine. That was something that it never did previously. This is a real gear change that Ursula von der Leyen has been able to kind of put through since this war began, and there's been a lot of wrangling within the EU about where that munition is going to come from. Some countries blocking purchases of munition for Ukraine from outside the bloc, kind of protectionist reasons. That's angered a lot of people here in Ukraine who say, you've got time to have all these arguments, we need that munition yesterday rather than in 6 months' time. So I think she's going to try and smooth some of that over and try and really convince people here that she is serious about the EU getting a kind of military role as well as a kind of humanitarian financial role. And obviously millions of Ukrainians living in the EU, it's about their status as refugees, their ability to maybe come back, visit people in Ukraine, then go back to countries in Europe. It's a huge logistical issue, and one that so far has been going fairly well. I think lots of people in Ukraine are very grateful and recognize the fact that without that possibility to send families, children, old people to countries in neighboring countries in the EU, the situation here in Ukraine would be a lot harder. When you go to the front lines, they often tell you, we're just grateful that we can be calm that our family are there.
Nick, sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is just beginning his speech on Victory Day over Nazi Germany. Let's cut over to Moscow and listen in.
I congratulate you on the day of victory. We honor our fathers, grandfathers that were glorious and whose names are to be remembered forever. They have sacrificed a lot in order to save the earth from Nazism. Once again, we are at a turning point. Again, there are enemies, and there is a real war going on around us. But we are standing up against international terrorism. We defend our security and Donbas. For us, for Russia, there are no enemy nations, neither in the West nor in the East. The majority of people on Earth thinks like we do. We want to see a world that is free, stable and peaceful. We think that every ideology of superiority is horrendous, is terroristic. The global elites still believe they are superior. They are provoking bloodshed, conflicts, and they nourish nationalism and Russophobia. They destroy family values, traditional values that make men human beings. They do that in order to dictate, to impose their will onto the people. They want to grab everything they can. And we have not forgotten what it means when Nazis come to power. We have not forgotten who has started such horrible events, and we have sacrificed our lives in order to save the peoples of Europe. We once again see that memorials to the Soviet soldiers, the great armed forces, are being destroyed. Nazis and their helpers are once again surfacing, and they would like to prevail. And this is disrespect for the sacrifices. We see the attempts of those who would like to once again attack Russia. They have developed neo-Nazi niches all around the world, and they would like to destroy our country, make it disintegrate. And as a conclusion of the Second World War, they think they want to overthrow international law, and they would like to crush all centers of development that want to be free. And therefore, there is a tragedy that can unfold once again. This is a disaster that we see in the Ukraine at the moment. Ukraine has become hostage to such horrendous Western regimes. They are using everything they can in order to implement their plans. We honor the legacy of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War. But we now have to stand up and counteract neo-Nazis once again. The armies of the United States, the UK and other countries, they have participated in defeating Japan, nationalism and fascism. We have fought against many threats, and this is our legacy that we are going to follow today. Today, when there is a movement to create a multipolar, just world, we stand up for security, indivisible securities. We want to make sure that every country, that every nation has rights to develop freely. Today in Moscow, we have assembled the leaders of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Together, we fought in the Great Patriotic War. All the nations of the Soviet Union have made a contribution to the victory. We will remember that forever, and we cherish the memory of everyone whose life was taken in that war. We greet their fathers, their sons, their daughters, And we remember all the brothers, sisters, wives, husbands, relatives that have sacrificed during that war. Let's have a moment of silence.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Уважаемые граждане России,
Dear citizens of
битвы,
Russia,
решающие для судеб нашей Родины,
the battles that are so decisive for our homeland have always been sacred to us. We follow our ancestors. We understand what it means to follow their achievements. We are proud to be part of the special military operation. Everybody who serves at the front makes sure that people are being saved, that wounded people are being saved. Your work, your service at the front is so important for our country. The future of our country, of our nation, depends on it. And you are proud to defend your country. You fight for Russia. Your families, your children, your friends are waiting for you. They are convinced that you feel their endless love. Our country stands united to honor our heroes. Everybody is ready to help. Everybody is praying for you. Comrades, friends, veterans, in every family we have one member that has participated in the Great Patriotic War. We remember our heroes. We have our memorial places to think of them. Today we stand at the Red Square, on this very ground where Yuri Dolgoruki and other heroes fought. The parades were always taking place here, also in 1945. Today, we have also members of the special military operation present. These are members of the armed forces that serve as professionals or are working, serving temporarily. We have the FSB here. We have armed forces from Donetsk and Lugansk. I would like to welcome all of you. I would like to welcome all of you who is fighting for Russia, everyone who is on the front, at the front line. You are successors of our heroic ancestors. They have shown that our unity is the strongest element we have. Nothing can be stronger than our love to our homeland, to Russia, to our noble armed forces, to victory. Hooray!